In the flickering glow of tallow candles inside a cramped 14th century sickroom, the physician's hands trembled as he pressed a dried toad against the swollen black buboes rising on his patient's neck. The man's breath came in ragged gasps, each one laced with the metallic tang of blood and the sour reek of decay that no herbal incense could mask. Outside, the bells of the parish church tolled slowly, their mournful notes drifting over rooftops where laundry still hung on lines and bread ovens still smoked, as if life could simply continue. This was medicine before science, a world without answers, where every remedy rested on the ancient writings of Galen and the invisible balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile dictated by the stars and the will of God. Physicians studied urine colors in glass flasks, consulted astrological charts for the precise hour to bleed a patient, and prescribed prayers alongside poultices of viper flesh and arsenic. They believed they understood the body completely, yet when death arrived it came without warning, without mercy, and without explanation. The collapse did not begin with chaos, it began quietly in the confidence of men who thought they held the keys to life itself. But no one understood what was coming next, as the first faint rumors drifted in from the east like smoke on the horizon, carried by merchants who spoke of entire cities vanishing in distant lands. Europe in the mid-1300s stood at the height of its medieval order, a civilization built on faith, hierarchy, and the inherited wisdom of antiquity, yet utterly unprepared for the invisible force that would expose every flaw in its medical worldview. Across the continent, daily life unfolded in rhythms unchanged for centuries. In the countryside, serfs rose before dawn to till fields with wooden plows, their hands calloused and their backs bent under the weight of feudal obligation, while the air carried the earthy scent of turned soil and wood smoke from hearth fires. Villages clustered around stone churches, whose bells marked the hours of prayer, and markets buzzed with the chatter of women selling eggs and cheese, the lowing of cattle, and the laughter of children chasing dogs through muddy lanes. In crowded cities like Florence and Paris, artisans hammered iron in narrow workshops, merchants haggled over bolts of silk and barrels of wine, and families gathered in timber-framed houses where the smell of roasting meat mingled with the damp must of thatched roofs. Physicians made their rounds in long robes, carrying staffs topped with pomanders, stuffed with rose petals, and cloves to ward off the bad air they called miasma. Midwives delivered babies by candlelight using herbal infusions passed down through generations, and barber surgeons set broken bones with crude splints while singing hymns to Saint Cosmas. Life felt predictable, anchored by the certainty that the body was a microcosm of the cosmos and that illness could always be corrected if the humors were realigned. Families trusted their healers the way they trusted the turning of seasons, never imagining that the very systems meant to protect them were built on foundations of guesswork and ancient authority. The routines continued unbroken plowing, trading, praying, while beneath the surface, something stirred that no chart or prayer could foresee. Yet early warning signs flickered like distant lightning, invisible to those who refused to see. Travelers returning from the Black Sea spoke in hushed tones of a pestilence so fierce that it emptied the trading posts of Kaffa, where corpses piled in the streets and the living fled in terror. Genoese ships docking in Messina in October 1347 carried sailors whose bodies were already marked by strange dark swellings, their eyes hollow with fever. Port officials noted the unusual number of dead rats washing up along the quays, but dismissed it as a minor nuisance, never suspecting a connection. Physicians examined the first victims and declared the illness a corruption of the air caused by planetary alignments or divine displeasure, prescribing the same bloodletting and herbal decoctions that had always worked before. Church leaders called for processions and fasting, certain that repentance would restore balance. No one yet grasped that the disease moved through fleas and breath, because the very concept of invisible living organisms lay centuries beyond their imagination. The signs remained scattered, easy to ignore amid the press of daily commerce and the comfort of familiar explanations. By the time the first households in Sicily fell silent, the invisible enemy had already slipped ashore and begun its quiet work, spreading along trade routes like ink through water. Still, the world carried on, convinced that its medicine, rooted in the wisdom of Hippocrates and Galen, would prevail as it always had. Tension rose slowly at first, then with terrifying speed, as reports from port to port painted a picture too vast to ignore. In the winter of 1347, entire districts of Italian cities began to empty, not by decree, but by the simple fact that families were vanishing overnight. The stench of unburied bodies drifted through alleyways, overpowering the usual smells of baking bread and livestock. Physicians gathered in universities to debate whether the cause lay in the conjunction of Saturn and Mars or in the corruption of the four humors by poisonous vapors. Yet their debates changed nothing as patients continued to die within hours of the first symptoms. Civic leaders imposed curfews and ordered bonfires in the streets to purify the air, but the flames only added smoke to the miasma they feared. Merchants shuttered their shops, yet the disease traveled with the very goods they once traded: cloth, grain, even the fleas hidden in the folds. Fear began to replace routine. Mothers kept children indoors, priests heard confessions through closed doors, and the once familiar sound of laughter gave way to the constant tolling of bells. The medical establishment, so long revered, found itself powerless, its treatments accelerating death rather than preventing it. Bloodletting weakened already fevered bodies, while purging only dehydrated the sick further. The system that had governed health for 1,000 years began to crack under the weight of its own inadequacy, yet those in power clung to it, unwilling to admit that their answers had always been illusions. Key decisions, born of desperation and ancient prejudice, only deepened the crisis. Town councils in Venice and Florence ordered the isolation of the sick on offshore islands, an early form of quarantine that came too late and without understanding of how the illness spread. Flagellant processions snaked through city streets, men whipping their own backs until the cobblestones ran red, believing that self-inflicted suffering would appease an angry God. In some regions, Jewish communities became scapegoats, accused of poisoning wells in a conspiracy to destroy Christendom. Mobs dragged families from their homes and burned them alive while physicians stood by, offering no scientific counter to the hysteria. Rulers issued edicts banning travel, yet smugglers and desperate refugees carried the plague deeper inland. The church, once the moral anchor, struggled to bury the dead fast enough, its priests dying alongside their flocks. Medical faculties at Paris and Montpellier issued treatises insisting the plague was caused by astrological imbalance, recommending the wearing of gemstones and the avoidance of certain foods, measures that did nothing to slow the invisible killer. Every choice, every decree, every ritual reflected a worldview that placed faith above evidence, authority above observation. The pressures mounted as food supplies dwindled, trade collapsed, and the labor force that sustained the feudal order began to vanish. The mistakes were not born of malice alone, but of a medical tradition that had never been forced to confront its own limits until now. The moment the system began to fail arrived not with a single cataclysm, but with the relentless accumulation of empty streets and silent homes. By the spring of 1348, the plague had reached Paris, London, and the Low Countries, turning bustling markets into ghost towns where only the wind moved through abandoned stalls. Physicians themselves fell ill and died, their robes stained with the same black fluid they had tried to drain from others. Hospitals overflowed with the dying, the air inside thick with the groans of the suffering and the metallic smell of blood and vomit. Corpses lay in heaps outside city gates, collected by hired gravediggers who worked at night to avoid the living. The old medical texts, copied so carefully by monks, offered no guidance for a disease that ignored every humoral rule. Families watched loved ones swell, bleed, and perish within days, then burned the bedding and the clothes in futile attempts to cleanse the air. The silence that followed each death was heavier than any bell, a void where answers should have been. The collapse was no longer theoretical, it was visceral, measured in the growing distance between what healers promised and what reality delivered. By the time summer brought its relentless heat, the medical order that had defined European civilization for centuries lay in ruins, exposed as powerless against an enemy it could neither see nor name. Human consequences spread like cracks through every layer of society. Entire villages stood empty, their fields overgrown with weeds and livestock wandering untended. Survivors wandered the countryside in shock, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with grief that no prayer could soothe. The labor shortage shattered the feudal system. Peasants who once worked for nothing now demanded wages, refusing to return to the old order when so few hands remained to till the soil. In cities, the dead outnumbered the living, and the social fabric tore as thieves looted empty homes while others formed makeshift burial crews just to survive. Children orphaned by the plague roamed the streets in packs, their cries echoing where laughter once rang. The church, unable to provide spiritual comfort or physical protection, saw its authority fracture. Some priests fled while others died ministering, leaving the faithful to question why God had abandoned them. Art began to reflect the horror paintings of skeletal figures leading dances of death, frescoes showing the rich and poor equal in the grave. Fear turned inward, neighbors accused one another of sin, and trust evaporated like morning mist. The breakdown was total, not merely of bodies but of the bonds that had held civilization together for generations. Long-term historical impact reshaped the continent in ways no one alive could have predicted. The massive die-off accelerated the decline of serfdom as landlords competed for scarce workers, paving the way for new economic relations that would eventually birth capitalism. Universities, once bastions of Galenic dogma, began to question inherited texts, planting the first seeds of empirical inquiry that would flower centuries later in the scientific revolution. The plague's shadow lingered in literature and law, inspiring quarantine regulations that endured for hundreds of years and forcing societies to confront the limits of faith-based medicine. Population recovery took generations, yet the rupture left Europe permanently altered, more skeptical, more mobile, more open to change. The old medical worldview, once unchallenged, now carried the stain of failure, its authority eroded by the simple fact that it had offered no answers when they mattered most. What had seemed eternal crumbled, replaced by a tentative new awareness that knowledge must be tested, not merely inherited. Yet even in the aftermath, the echoes of that world without answers refused to fade. Survivors rebuilt their homes and replanted their fields, but the memory of streets lined with corpses and physicians helpless before the invisible remained etched into the collective mind. The plague returned in waves for centuries, each outbreak reminding Europe that medicine built on astrology and humors could never fully protect them. The collapse had exposed the fragility of certainty, the danger of answers that comforted rather than cured. In the quiet moments between crises, when the bells fell silent and the air cleared, people began to wonder what lay beyond the old texts, what truths might be discovered if the body were studied not as a reflection of the stars but as a machine of flesh and blood. The rupture had been irreversible, carving a divide between the age of faith and ancient wisdom and the slow, painful dawn of something new. The world that emerged carried both the scars and the faint promise that one day medicine might finally possess real answers, though the price of learning that lesson had been measured in millions of unmarked graves. Centuries later, the lessons of that pre-scientific era still whisper through history's corridors. The Black Death stands as the ultimate testament to a civilization that trusted its healers completely yet possessed none of the tools to confront an invisible enemy. The routines of daily life, the confidence of physicians, the rituals of church and state all proved powerless when the humors failed and the stars offered no guidance. The collapse unfolded not in a single day but through months of mounting horror, each death another crack in the foundation of an entire worldview. Societies rebuilt, economies shifted, and knowledge evolved, yet the haunting truth endures. Without science, medicine is little more than elegant guesswork, and civilizations that rely on it walk blindly toward the next rupture. The air may smell sweeter now, the streets fuller, the bells less frequent, but the silence that once followed the dying still lingers in the collective memory, a reminder that answers are never guaranteed, only earned through relentless questioning. In the end, the world before science did not fall because it lacked intelligence, it fell because it lacked the courage to admit how little it truly knew.